Thank you so much. This is a really special panel because I'm talking with two of the esteemed musicians of these latitudes, each of whom has a profound odyssey, you might say, that stemmed from the terrible inundation, the massive flood in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. And just a brief word about each of these guys. Dr. Michael White is a premier clarinetist and composer in New Orleans-style music here in the city. Chris Thomas King, many of you probably know from the film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And his starring role there. He has many recordings and also a book, The Blues, which is both a personal and a cultural history. I have spent a great deal of time with Michael on a film project based on my last book, City of a Million Dreams. The documentary, which only took half my life, will actually be released later this year. We have a VOD coming, and in August, Louisiana Public Broadcasting will have it on with an offering to PBS stations. So I want to start, Chris, by asking you to tell us about your experience during Hurricane Katrina.
Well, thanks for that. And well, first, it's just a pleasure, being up here with these two gentlemen. And during Katrina, the thing that I remember most is I lived uptown. For people that know New Orleans, I was living on Willow Street, just a couple of blocks from here, between State and Nashville on Willow. And New Orleans is kind of strange because some streets flood totally, like the street I was on, and then 2 blocks away, they're picnicking in their front yard. But I was in New Orleans. I had to leave with my family, and I kind of made it back because we didn't have any ID. We didn't have anything. House was totally underwater. But I got into the house and got some identification from my family, and I slept in my car that night. And that was the night that George Bush was in Jackson Square addressing the nation. And it was a very eerie time, but that was my personal experience. And of course, that found its way into my book. It found its way into my music. And, we can talk more about how that experience manifested in my creativity.
I just want to follow up on that before I turn to Dr. White. When I was finishing the revised edition of the music history, Up from the Cradle of Jazz, which along with Chris's book is available in the book tent, this was 2009, and I was searching for lyrics to cover the experience, reflect the experience of the flood. And I connected with Chris, and he very kindly gave permission for use of that song. I wonder if you could give us the lyrics.
Yeah, he's referring to a song that I wrote. I wrote a whole suite of songs, then I released it on an album called Rise. And it was written when I evacuated to Houston, Nashville, other places. And but anyway, the lyric he speaks of is it's a slow blues tune that says, "When the levees broke, when the levees." It's hard to do it without my guitar in my hand.
You're doing fine.
Without my guitar, I'm lost, man. When the levees broke when the levees broke, baby, dirty water come rushing in. When the levees broke, dirty water come rushing in, washed away my happy home, babe. I hope it washed away my sins. That's the opening line.
Michael, why don't you tell us about your experience at that time?
Well, my experience with Katrina was a little spiritual. Like a lot of people in New Orleans, they didn't believe that that something like Katrina would happen. And I actually had a job I play every year at Tulane here for a freshman convocation ceremony with my Liberty Brass Band. And this was the night before. They said, you know, voluntary evacuation was called for. And I woke up the next morning and tried to find out if the job was still on at Tulane. Well, worse than worrying about a hurricane was trying to tell 10 New Orleans musicians they lost a gig. So I eventually found out the gig was canceled. I had a variety of responses. You know, some people were mad. Some people said, oh, that thing ain't coming here. Somebody said, well, I'm already in Baton Rouge, so who cares? Somebody else said, well, are we still going to get paid? You know? So I started kind of preparing to evacuate. I talked to my sister, and I had an 80-year-old mother and an aunt and a nephew who had recently had a heart transplant, and I was going to go with her. Her bank sent her to Houston. And I kind of said some prayers, and I went out to the lake, and this is true. And I kind of talked to the lake. People don't know I'm nuts, but I'm nuts. I kind of talked to the lake, and I said, are you going to come and take everything I own? And just then, I'm standing right on the shore, and a big wave came up and crashed against my feet. And I said a couple of curse words, went home, packed everything I could pack, put things up high, and went toward Houston. And that was the beginning for me. And you know, that was a long journey. Normally, it takes about 6 hours to get to Houston. It took me more than 30 hours to get to Houston. I was stuck in traffic, and it was craziness the whole way. So just that was an ordeal. But I'll stop for that right now.
Well, I can pick up the narrative thread here. Michael is the navigational figure in the film I made, and we had been working toward a major sequence when everyone had to evacuate. And I was worried about him. My wife and I took my mother. We went to my brother's home in Covington, then had to get my mother situated because her assisted living facility had flooded. We did that in New Iberia, and long story made very short, I was in Allen, Texas. This was about a month, 3.5 weeks after the storm. And of course, the city was closed. People couldn't get in because the floodwaters were slowly going down. And I'd been trying to reach Michael to see how he was doing because I knew from what I'd seen on Google Maps that that part of town had taken a lot of water. And he finally called me, and I was sitting on the front porch of this house with this sun-baked suburb of Dallas. The world is new. All the houses are new. And I'll never forget his words. I think my house took 8 feet of water. And so we had filmed a number of interviews at that point, and I said, look, if you're going in, if you don't mind, I'd like to get a guy with a camera and follow you. And so we did that. And it was really one of the most painful experiences, I think, certainly of my life, and I suspect of his, and it's now about a 6-minute thread in the film. And from that time forward, I watched Michael go through an enormous struggle with the Road Home program, having to commute with his responsibilities for his mother and his aunt. By the time we were able to regroup on the film, it was, I guess, close to 2010 or even later than that. But I do believe the experience of coming back has colored so many people, even those who didn't lose their homes or were fortunate, as I was, to only have damage in the yard but not in the house. So I'm curious to ask both you guys, and Chris, maybe you can lead off. What was it like to finally come back and have terra firma, ground beneath your feet, a place?
Well, I'm still not back. Um, I live today in Prairieville, Louisiana. And Prairieville is closer to Baton Rouge than it is to New Orleans. But, you know, there was a lot of cities we were in, and then we decided we go to Prairieville, find a place there so I can get right back on the highway and rebuild. And it's really difficult to kind of even talk about this period, because I was just telling Jason earlier today that you get started on this subject and there's such deep-rooted, you know, pain and trauma, you know, that goes on. And just for example, you might have a home, just say a 2,200 square foot home in one part of New Orleans, and you need lumber to rebuild it. But the lumber costs the same no matter you're building it there or uptown, but you're only given, you know, pennies if you're in a certain part of town, and, you know, how can you rebuild with that? So and, you know, and I'm kind of editing myself because I don't want to get into certain personal things, but, you know, there was all kinds of corruption, all kinds of misunderstandings about what was happening. So I'll just talk about it without getting into real detail about why I'm still in Prairieville. And the remnants and the financial hit well, I'll share with you one thing that's difficult to talk about. I had flood insurance that I had to have because I was in a flooded area. But you have to sign that over to your mortgager. And my mortgage at the time was a defunct company called Countrywide. Everybody already know where I'm going with this. And in the process of me trying to rebuild my home, they stopped answering my contacts and calls, hired an attorney, you know, they stopped answering. And then I read in the paper one day that they were sold to Bank of America. This is like 2 or 3 years after, and I'm wondering why I'm not getting the responses, and they're just excuses as to why they can't send my money. Long story short, most of my flood money, which was, I think, about 190, they kept, never got it. And hired attorneys and stuff and everything. But usually the whole system kind of worked with the money folks. And so if you're independent, trying to battle these you know, big insurance companies and things like that, it's a horrible thing. So even though I had flood insurance, checked all the boxes, did all the things you're supposed to do, still wasn't able to get my flood money, which is supposed to be from the federal government. They're supposed to protect a certain amount of money that's in a bank, up to what, 250 or something? All that is just, it's nice rhetoric until you have to practice it. So anyway, I'm still in Prairieville, and it's but it was so crazy when America shut down just a couple of years ago. We all experienced this traumatic event with the virus, and banks were just handing everybody money. You know, you get some money, everybody got some money. It wasn't like that during Katrina. A lot of the changes that were made with FEMA and things like this, they've made a lot of progress, you know, and so hopefully people that deal with the fires and people that deal with the flooding and all the traumatic things that are happening around, it just seems like it's not even a big deal like Katrina was anymore, because it happens so often. A lot of progress have been made, but back when Katrina happened, and what triggered me to write the album that I wrote was when people see people flooded out of their homes, they're being flooded, and there's a Walmart, and not a Walmart or Walgreens or something, and you need some sanitation, or you need water, or you need some dry shoes or something to put on your feet, and people were making fun of us, you know, for trying to salvage what we could. Like in other words, we can go into the store and buy it from somebody when the whole city is shut down. So it was out of that kind of pain and things that I wrote the album Rise. I called it Rise. I knew we would rise again, but it also wanted me to, as a writer, with my book. This is the book, The Blues, The Authentic Narrative of My Music and Culture. So I was in the midst of researching this, and I wanted to get the history of music and the history of New Orleans right, and it inspired me to dig a little bit deeper, to go a little bit more in depth, and take this book even more serious to kind of get the narrative right, because at the time, as a musician, we were wondering if what was gonna happen to our culture, our continuum. So there was a lot of personal trauma, but I tried to take that and put it into the best thing I knew how. It was in poetry and song and eventually in a book.
Wow. That's strong.
Tip of the iceberg, brother.
I want to talk about a core theme of that book in just a moment. But first, Michael, I wonder if you could bring the audience up to date on how you finally got squared away anew with all of the struggles with the road home money and so forth that Chris went through from your side.
Well, when the storm came, I made one terrible mistake that a lot of people, I'm sure, can relate to, and that is I became an addict of the news. And I looked at news endlessly for days and days and days about Katrina and different things that happened. And eventually, of course, that kind of thing takes a toll on you. The word that Chris used is very appropriate, trauma, and that trauma has a lot of emotional effects that can also become physical effects. So I had a very difficult time in Houston. I found myself all of a sudden a parent to two 80-year-olds, and I didn't know what was going to happen to the music, the culture. I had lost a tremendous amount of things that I had collected over the years. My mother would have said I was a junk collector, but I had collected, I had a massive archive of materials that came from the New Orleans jazz tradition, musical instruments that belonged to people. I had a classic white mouthpiece that belonged to Sidney Bechet. You see it in pictures that he played when he played on clarinet. I had sheet music from some of the earliest brass band recordings. I lost more than 50 clarinets. Some of them were vintage and going back to the 1890s and things like that. I lost interviews. I had interviewed many musicians in this generation when I was coming along that was born between the late 1890s and 1910, and many of those musicians became my friends and mentors, and I had interviewed a lot of them. I had a lot of transcriptions and interviews on tape and notes scribbled here and there about things that are not in jazz history books. I was going to use that on a book. And I lost, many, many, many other things, what I won't get into, thousands of recordings, CDs, rare recordings, films, and all those kinds of things. It was very difficult being in Houston, which is a strange place sometimes because it's so large and you kind of get lost in Houston. You can drive up Westheimer, seems like 3 hours and you're still on Westheimer. You start to see the same places over and over again. It's like Twilight Zone, I made it. But it was really difficult dealing with different agencies. And then I needed medical care for my mother, my aunt, my nephew, and all of that was really, really tough. And that was harder than losing everything. I had a number of national interviews and stuff, and they focused on my archive and this and that and the other. But really trying to survive in Houston and starting to commute was the tough part. So since then, like Chris, all of that trauma kind of eventually came to influence my music. And a few years ago, I started writing songs, writing every day. Now I have a few hundred songs, and trying to do some things with those songs. And, the thing that I came to realize about Katrina is that, Chris said he's not back. I live in New Orleans, but in a lot of ways, I'm not back either. Emotionally, spiritually, you start to realize if you're affected like thousands of us were, some people weren't, but you start to realize that life as you knew it is gone. And you have to adjust to a new life, a new beginning. And it can take you years and years to do that. So I really think only in the last couple of years am I starting to really come back into my own and accept this new life and sort of prosper in it. But emotionally, physically, financially, it's been a tough 20 years. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years.
I know.
I just want to underline what you just said, that it's tough to accept that you can't, the life you had, you can't get it back. And the sooner you can kind of deal with that, I just have to underline that, because that is so true. And you just don't know that until you experience something like that, you can't. Because your whole world is just destroyed in a day.
Yeah, but I'm fortunate in that I feel like now I'm like a phoenix rising from the ashes. The thing is, you start to come into your own, and then you realize, hey, I'm too old to do all this stuff that I know how to do now. But we'll see. We'll see what I can do.
How many albums, how many CDs have you released since? Was it Blue Crescent? Was that the first one after the storm?
Yeah, I've made a lot of recordings in my day. I'm on more than 100 recordings. Some of them with very famous people. Haven't recorded with this guy yet, but I'm hoping that happens soon.
I'm working on that.
We're working on it, yeah. But I felt really bad, and I was very fortunate to get a residency at a place called a Studio in the Woods, which is a local artist retreat. I was their first resident musician, and I needed that retreat desperately because I was really stressed out and out of it. I mean, my mother was sick and had to be hospitalized, and my aunt wanted to come back home. My nephew was dealing with changes from, heavy heart medication. I'm worried about, what's going to happen with jazz, and my job, I was teaching at the time at Xavier, what's going to happen with that and all that. So it was a lot of stress, and I was finally able to get a residency at a Studio in the Woods and just relax. I just rested. A Studio in the Woods is, even though it's in New Orleans, it doesn't seem like it's in New Orleans. It's, in Algiers, near the end of the parish line against the levee, and it's pure nature, animals, trees, great. And so I just relaxed, rested, and after a couple of days, I started to get song ideas that reflected the mood that I was in, and I thought about the city. And so I came up with a bunch of songs, and I recorded them on a CD called Blue Crescent. And the whole idea of blue was significant to me, because blue could mean, blue as in sad, like in the blues or something, or blue could mean, optimism, hope, clarity, blue sky, future. So I wrote a bunch of songs, and to my surprise, at first everything was sad, minor keys. But after that, it turned out on the album, only one of the songs was really sad. It's one called Katrina, which I can't listen to anymore. But the rest of the songs are optimistic, hopeful, and some nostalgic. And I thought that reflected the mood of the people that I talked to from New Orleans, some that were in Houston, some of my friends, different people. So yeah, it did have a positive effect on music, because it was the beginning process of me really sort of starting to seriously compose.
I think for everyone who experienced the profound dislocation of having to leave, to evacuate, hoping your home would be there when you returned, whether it was or was not, I venture to say that the last 2 decades have been a slow process of resurrection, with not everyone on the same step of the ladder, so to speak. One of the songs on that album is called Sunday Morning. I wonder if you could give us a little background on what inspired those lyrics and perhaps a sense of the poetry there.
My first years as a jazz musician, I played in a brass band. And one of the big kinds of jobs that we used to do was church parades. The kind of church parades we used to do don't exist anymore. Those were with a New Orleans brass band and one or more black, usually Baptist churches, and they would parade to celebrate a pastor's anniversary, Sunday school, the founding of a new church, a religious holiday, or something like that. And it was those church parades were really beautiful. They were like a much milder and tamer version of the second line. They would be early on Sunday mornings, and in those days, the rowdy people from Saturday night weren't up yet. So you had a smaller crowd, and you would have divisions of church members dressed, very well dressed. Men, women would wear white dresses, men would wear black suits, and the children were like miniature versions of the adults. And they would have banners and flags, and the reverends would be up front. And, every time there was a parade, the reverend would come up to the band leader and say, "Now look, you're parading for the Lord, none of that jazz. Just hymns." So we played up-tempo versions of hymns, not slow like at a jazz funeral. They were always up-tempo versions of traditional hymns, but played with as much jazz as you play in second lines and everything else. And it was always great to see the church members, brothers and sisters, kind of strutting gracefully to the music. And as the music got excited, they wanted to break out into a real second line, but they were trying to be reserved. But that happened. Now I forgot the rest of the question.
The lyrics of Sunday morning.
Oh, Sunday morning. That's a long way to get to Sunday morning. So
you're doing a good job.
I thought about the tradition of church parades and how proud the people looked in the community. They took on another significance, not just celebrating whatever. There was a certain kind of pride and dignity, but also spiritual strength and power that you could see on people's faces. And it was such a powerful image in my mind. I would give up playing a good paying job in a hotel to play in a church parade and make $10 because it was worth a lot more than the money. So I thought about that, and I thought about how people in New Orleans could rebuild the city, and I thought about it through perhaps a religious way, and I thought about the church parade. So I came up with this song called Sunday Morning. It was inspired by that tradition, and I had words to it, and my good friend and trumpet player Greg Stafford sang those words, and we recorded that song, and Jason used it in the film. And the whole idea of the lyrics is it's about come together Sunday morning when the light takes the darkness from the sky. Come together Sunday morning, we will march together by and by. And the idea was that the citizens of New Orleans could come together, rebuild the city, and progress and move forward.
I want to turn now back to Chris and the core theme of your book about the blues. And I have to say, when I read the book, I was really drawn in by it. I did a long piece in the Daily Beast on Chris's book and Imani Perry's previous book about a journey back through the South. And there's a sort of blues linkage, if you will, but between those two books. Why don't you give us a sense of the basic theme that you were advancing in that book?
Yeah, what I found in for those of you who aren't familiar with my story, real briefly, it should be noted that my family ran a juke joint here in Louisiana called Tabby's Blues Box and Heritage Hall. So as a young teen, the blues was the family business. Saturday nights all throughout the 80s. I used to hear about a show called Saturday Night Live, but for a decade I had no idea what it was because my weekends were always on the family farm, so to speak. And I didn't always want to be at my dad's club. My dad's name was Chabby Thomas. He was a recording artist and blues, juke joint owner and that type of thing. And so and then the club was raised by the city of Baton Rouge to build a bridge, and around the year 2000. So I started off just writing a memoir about coming of age in my dad's juke joint. You know, I had found success in movies like Old Brother Where Art Thou I was mentioned earlier as an actor, and I had, you know, co-starred in the movie Ray, the Ray Charles story, and did the score. I did scores to movies, and I worked with Ray Charles on that score, scored Old Brother and things like that. So you have some success, and then people say, let's write a local boy does good book, you know. And you don't think, you know, you're not going to get that deep with it, but you're just going to tell these stories about coming of age in a juke joint. That'll be interesting to tell that story. And then Katrina happened. And Katrina happened along the way. My dad was you know, kind of dealing with Alzheimer's at the time, you know. And so I started feeling like, you know, certain things were slipping away. And it kind of made me want to find the real story of the blues and try to, because I felt that I was, well, I'm 62 now, but I mean, I've been doing this for like 50 years, you know, playing professionally. But my dad and his generation and stuff kind of connects to the early blues here in Louisiana. And my dad always said the blues came from Louisiana. And a lot of things, he made songs, the hoodoo party and the voodoo and all that kind of stuff, all that mystical stuff was mixed into music. I knew that on Saturday nights at my dad's club, people came there smiling and dancing, and people would get married and stuff, you know, meet people and later marry, you know, on our dance floor. So I knew the blues was not the sad, down in the dumps, depressed thing that we had been told, because it just wasn't what we were selling. You know, we were selling dance music and warm beer, basically. You know, but so when I decided to delve deep, I started uncovering all the myths. You know, I went to the crossroads and, you know, did some research, and I can assure you, I didn't meet the devil at the crossroads. That's mythology, you know. And if the devil was at the crossroads, I'd like to say that there'd be a traffic jam trying to get to the devil to get your dreams to come true. But so as I delved deeply into the music and the culture and the history, you know, it turns out that the blues, you know, began here in Louisiana. I mean, I always kind of felt that, but I didn't know it for sure like I know it today. And as you research the early musicians, the Jelly Roll Martin, Clarence Williams, King Oliver, you know, these early musicians who started this thing, including a few women like Mamie Des Dunes. When you go back to them, they never used the word jazz when they spoke about the music. The music didn't really have a name, except they would say he could really play the blues, or he really played the blues. But later, after everybody went home, after midnight, then they put the cake and these other kind of formal dance things where you have a dance partner, and all, they put all that away, and after midnight they let the hair down, they really played the blues. And that's how people talked about it. And so the key is what I found I was doing is deciphering the old Creole language and the old Creole way of knowing and talking about the culture that people used then, and people call themselves the Creole band, the Creole this, the Creole that. And so in Creole language, blues is a pushback to blue laws, where they had blue laws around saying no dancing, no buying alcohol on a Sunday, no gambling, no fraternizing with, you know, mixed races and whatever. There was all kinds of blue laws, these Protestant blue laws around, and some of them still linger, that wanted to stop the traditions that we have here in South Louisiana. I mean, people have been playing at Congo Square, playing the drums and playing the music uninterrupted, you know, for a couple hundred years, since the 1700s. But on Sundays, it's like no music, no this, no that. So when they used the word blues, it meant it meant like soccer blue, or something that was vice, music of vice. You bring this music here come the gamblers, here come all the other stuff that come with it. But the Anglo definition of the word blues is down in the dumps, depressed, sad, melancholy. But that definition didn't come to the music until much later. So if you let the early musicians, if you quote them, if you quote the early musicians, they don't use the word jazz. And that's a whole nother story how we got left with that word. But so when I say that the blues originated in Louisiana, which I found in my book, and that's the main theme of it, and then just dispelling all these myths about people going to prisons to record people, calling it folk music, and the discovery of lead belly. And I used certain characters to show that there was a eugenic angle to these people masquerading as folklorists, and they really weren't folklorists. They thought that they could record black people's consciousness, and these little waveforms we see on our computers, they didn't understand what that was in the early days, and they thought that if those waveforms spiked at this place or spiked at this interval, that meant that this person is, some kind of deviant sexually or prone to criminality if it spiked here. Today, when we talk on our computers or do a podcast, we see those little spikes, and we just put a compressor on it or something, But they read all kind of weird meanings into this stuff. And so a lot of times they were recording people with chains on, but can the man sing without chains? Probably. I mean, what does the chains have to do with capturing and a song? You just want a song from somebody who, if they're an informant, you just want it to be correct. Give me the proper translation of the poetry or something. What clothes you have on or whether you got chains on your feet or not shouldn't have anything to do with a researcher researching songs. So they want researching songs, and I point that out in my book. So anyway, that book goes through a lot of stages dispelling all kinds of things that have kind of separated my good friend here from me. He came up in the quote-unquote Dixieland jazz or jazz scene. I came up in the quote-unquote folk blues scene, and we were kind of separated musically. We still haven't recorded together. We want to get together. We want to do things, but we're cut from the same cloth. We playing the same music, and so anyway, I could go on and on, but I wrote a book about it. But the important thing to know is when I say that the blues definitely began here in Louisiana. And if somebody begs to differ, we do a Q&A. If you got some other information, share it with us. But the evidence says that it began here. And as far as Mississippi go, it must be said that there were no black people in Mississippi, what they call the Mississippi Delta in northern Mississippi. There were no black people there. There's no graveyards, there's no churches, there's no pottery in the ground. It's like a Disneyland that they just made up a myth about the blues came from northern Mississippi. And in fact, northern Mississippi is not even the Delta. This is the Mississippi Delta right here. And I know that because we were on our rooftops during Katrina. If this is not the Mississippi Delta, I don't know what is.
Hang on, wait a minute. I just want to bring a little fine point onto this. When you're talking about Mississippi, as I recall from your book, the area we refer to as the Mississippi Delta had not been cleared for plantations until the early 20th century.
That's correct.
Which comes after the upsurge of music we now call jazz and blues in New Orleans. So when he's referring to people going out with tape recorders, arguably one of the most famous books is late in his life, Alan Lomax, the great pioneering scholar, wrote a book called The Land Where the Blues Began. And it's about his experiences going into the Mississippi Delta in the 40s and 50s and the research and folklore gathering that he did. It's a fascinating book. But the title, with all respect to the late great scholar, I think is deceptive. So, Michael, I want to turn to you and get your cut on Chris's theory.
Yeah, I find that very interesting because I was very fortunate to, play with this generation of musicians that were the contemporaries of Jelly Roll Morton, Sidney Bechet, Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, and some of them had played and recorded with these guys, and they told me a lot about the music and the history of the music. But when I was coming along, I mean, there was nobody teaching how to play New Orleans jazz, traditional New Orleans jazz. And so, you just learn. My first job, the first church parade, they hired me. I was dressed. I was standing out there. The people came out. The band was there. We tuned up. And next thing you know, I heard 3 beats of the bass drum. Boom, boom, boom. That means the music is starting. I'm like, wait a minute, what are we playing? What key is it in? What's the structure? What am I supposed to do? Nobody said. There was no music. So, you learn there was a sort of mentorship program from the older musicians. And so when I started playing with some of those guys, like in smaller bands, they'd call a number, and I'd be like, I don't know this song. What is it like? And they would always say, oh, that's one of them blues. You'll get it. You'll hear it. And it could be a march. And they would say, oh, that's one of them blues songs. So they referred to the music as blues. And also in the early days, sometimes they referred to the music as ragtime. And some of the bands called themselves ragtime bands. One of the things that I learned that was very important was that the traditional black New Orleans jazz, as I learned it, is not Dixieland. A lot of people think that, but that's a whole nother tradition, commercialized and imitative of the real black New Orleans jazz, which is the original jazz. I had to say that. But I learned a lot of that from the older musicians. So Chris's book and his theory about Mississippi makes sense to me, because one of the things that we've done some programs together and we've played together before, but one of the things that came up in our discussions was that a lot of the older Mississippi blues people were kind of giving lesser versions of some of the stuff New Orleans jazz people were already doing. And Chris pointed that out to me. And it was like, oh yeah, and I went back, and I love the old blues and stuff like that. But when he said that, I started listening more intensely with a different ear. And I could hear, a lot of the songs are similar or derived from the same kind of songs, like Make Me a Pallet on Your Floor, Careless Love, those kind of songs. And it's like, oh, wow. And interestingly, a lot of the older blues players that recorded, the first ones that people know about, they recorded after New Orleans jazz. Right. So those recordings were already out there in the world for people to hear and do. So I think Chris brought up several important points, and I'm happy to say the blues started here, because it feels like it. Yeah.
Heresy has begun at Tulane University. We only have about 1:43, so I'd like to ask each of you to give us just sort of a summary, mindful of the clock, of how you have absorbed. I mean, each of you has touched on it, but as we approach the 20th anniversary, where do you stand now with the load you had to carry to get here from back in '05?
Well, I mean, in 5 seconds, it's tough to sum up, but I can just say that it just means, for me, the music that I've been making since Katrina, starting with the album Rise, and the album Rise, by the way, ended with a song, What a Wonderful World. Ah. So there's a nod to, I knew the sun would rise, I knew the city would rise again. The question was what was it going to be? And I think it's for, the people in the creative community, here to shape it. But also, I used to be the young rebel blues guy, but as you mature, you kind of want to, leave a bit of a legacy to, or leave some. You don't want to just kind of be washed, have the knowledge and the history washed away. And I think that hopefully my book is a counter narrative that kind of helps to sustain.
Finally, after getting over, Katrina was the beginning of a lot of devastating things that, that was sort of continued cycle of my family kind of being decimated. After getting over a lot of the trauma of that and rebuilding and moving on with life, I've gotten into a creative period, and I start to realize some of the things I need to do. not only with music, but with other things, because I've been told a lot of things by musicians that are not in jazz history books. And so I'm sitting between two published authors, but I've written a memoir that talks about all of those things. It's not published yet. I'm still editing, but I mean, it should be out. And I talk about the history of the music as I knew it as a young man and growing up in New Orleans and different parts of that. So 20 years later, I think it starts out with Katrina. And if I didn't have the Katrina experience, I wouldn't have been able to write a book like this, because Katrina becomes the main focal point of how life changed, and it caused a reflection back on all the things that I learned. And I was able to take the emotion from all of those things and use it in these different creative ways. So, you know, that's what.
Hopefully we can showcase that book at a future Tulane book festival.
And if I might, if you guys are interested, I'm doing a book signing just in the next half hour or so. So if you guys are interested in continuing this conversation, that's where I'll be.
It's a great book, get it. Jason's too.
Thank you.